Here are two of the most impressive tablets, the Tab S10 Ultra and the M4 iPad Pro. But their approach to things are quite different in many ways, like Samsung's anti-reflection coating versus the matte nanotexture on the iPad, and Samsung's desktop-like experience, but with a more underpowered mobile chip. The iPad has all the processing power in the world, but still with a wonky cursor. So what can each of these devices really do for you alongside your computer and phone? Let's take a look. The M4 iPad Pro and Tab S10 Ultra are similar in a lot of ways, but there are a few key differences that make one tablet seem better designed than the other. But starting with the similarities, both are incredibly thin. They're basically the same thinness, and both are also very lightweight. The Tab is quite a bit heavier, but it's not really surprising given how much taller it is. Moving on to the differences, and there are three areas about the physical build where the iPad just edges out. One, a pretty inconspicuous difference is the USB-C port itself. The iPad's port is USB 4 while the Tab's is still USB 3.2. And Type 4 can transfer data much faster and has better external display support. Another difference is that the iPad uses Face ID while the Tab still uses an under-display fingerprint scanner. And unlike the Samsung phones, it's not using an ultrasonic-based scanner, so it's slower and easily affected by moisture. Whereas Face ID seems to work even better on a tablet since you're less likely to be holding it at a weird angle. And third is the cameras. The Tab S10 Ultra has 4 cameras total, a wide and ultra-wide on both the front and the back. Now, it's not that more cameras are bad, it's just that these come at a pretty high cost of a significant notch on the front of the display. Do we really need an ultra-wide just to take some video calls? Instead of ultra-wide cameras, the iPad Pro has a LiDAR scanner, which is actually way more useful, especially for measuring things. But the Tab does have some great design features, such as a micro SD card slot, which is super helpful if you like keeping a lot of files and photos on your tablet, and it is a great place to look at them. The other unique thing about the Tab is the IP68 water resistance rating. It doesn't really rain where I live, so it hasn't really helped me, but I do remember having a laptop become water damaged in my backpack when I was caught in a rainstorm. So this rating can definitely save you sometimes. Where it gets more interesting is their screens, because both Apple and Samsung brought out new screen innovations, but they seem to have drastically different priorities. So both of these are 120Hz sharp OLED screens, but otherwise they're about as different as you can possibly get. First of all, the aspect ratio. The iPad Pro is almost a square, while the Tab S10 Ultra is very wide at 16:10. So their strengths and weaknesses are basically exactly opposite. I find the iPad makes for a much better writing and drawing canvas, especially when you're holding it in your hand. The Tab either feels awkwardly tall or a bit too wide. However, it's nicer to watch movies and videos on the Tab because most are 16:9 or an even wider aspect ratio. And here, with them side by side, for my videos, which are 2:1, you can see the Tab shows way less black bars. In fact, the video viewing area is about 42% larger on the Tab, and that's much bigger than I think their physical size would suggest. Another major distinction is their screen coatings. The Tab S10 Ultra got a new anti-reflection coating, and for the iPad Pro, you can expect it to have the nanotexture coating. Now, it's worth mentioning that every Tab S10 Ultra has a new coating, while nanotexture costs quite a bit extra because of the mandatory storage upgrade. I do have one of Apple's nanotexture displays here, not on the iPad, but how these two coatings reduce glare yields very different results. The Tab's coating really absorbs light, and so reflections are dimmed. The nanotexture more so diffuses the reflection so that you don't see sharp edges. However, when you're in a bright room, the amount of light being reflected back is more, and so it can look more hazy. And the nanotexture coating makes the display matte, while the Tab's coating is still glossy. So there are some circumstances where you can notice a little bit of color speckle on the matte screen. I find the Tab's coating to be better at reducing glare and minimizing the amount of light reflected, but some might prefer how the matte nanotexture screen feels, especially when you're using it with a stylus. And if you don't opt for the nanotexture upgrade, the Tab's coating is significantly better at anti-reflection than the iPad Pro's standard coating. But another screen upgrade that all the iPad Pros got is Tandem OLED, and that allows the large iPad screen to reach 1000 nits full screen brightness and 1600 nits peak brightness for HDR. The Tab still just reaches 600 nits for full screen and about 900 nits for HDR. That's definitely not bad, but it pales in comparison to the iPad, and when you're underneath the sun, you'll notice the difference. But if you're just in a normal bright room, it's less noticeable. When getting a tablet, you probably also think about whether you should get a pen or not. Well, actually for the Tab S10 Ultra, you don't have to decide because the S Pen comes with it for free. For the iPad Pro though, you all have to decide whether spending an extra $100 to $130 for the Apple Pencil is worth it. I have the Apple Pencil Pro here, and side by side, the free S Pen holds its own remarkably well, except for actually holding onto the tablet because it's stored in the back here, which is just a weird place to store the pen. If you don't have a case, it's constantly in danger of being knocked off, and when it's gone, you probably won't even notice. You can kind of keep it on the top side just like how it is on the iPad, but the magnet there is definitely weaker. Otherwise, both the S Pen and Apple Pencil Pro are tilt and pressure sensitive and has hover features. The fancier Apple Pencil does have this cool shadow and nice feeling haptic feedback. Oh, and it can do barrel roll too, but you can probably live without those features. As for the shortcuts, the S Pen has a button, and in many apps, you just hold it down to erase, so it's super quick. I prefer this over having to double tap the Apple Pencil. Now, you can also squeeze the Apple Pencil to change tools, but if you mainly just need to switch between writing and erasing, the S Pen button is still the fastest way to erase. The Apple Pencil does feel weightier and more premium, but I actually kind of like the lighter feel of the S Pen. They also have different tips. The S Pen has a rubber tip that feels very grippy against the screen, while the Apple Pencil has a plastic tip that feels more slippery. I personally prefer how the S Pen tip feels, but that's more so just personal preference. So yeah, even though the Apple Pencil Pro is nicer with more features, the best thing here is that the S Pen just comes in the box with the tab. Just please move the pen storage place to the side. When it comes to battery life, the battery size on the tab is only 10% bigger, but given that it has an 18% bigger screen, you might think that it'll have inferior battery life. However, after 2 hours and 20 minutes of playing back a 4K YouTube video at matched brightness, with both of them starting at 76%, the Tab S10 Ultra only dropped 1% more than the M4 iPad Pro. I also put them through running 1 hour of a gaming benchmark, and with both tablets starting at 100%, the iPad Pro's battery dropped by 35%, while the Tab S10 Ultra's only dropped by 21%. But the iPad Pro is also substantially faster. The benchmark scores aren't even close. The M4 iPad Pro easily matches the speed of the latest MacBooks, and sometimes it seems to have an identity crisis on whether it wants to be a computer or just a tablet. Having observed updates for both iPads and Samsung tablets over the years, my take is that neither operating system is robust enough to fully replace a traditional computer, and probably never will be. They're not really meant to replace a laptop for most people, but instead be like an additional device that you can still do some work on when you need as much portability and lightness as possible. And there are two key differences between the operating systems that affect how they perform as work devices. The additional performance of the M4 can be utilized in some games and professional grade apps. On the iPad Pro, there's DaVinci Resolve and Final Cut Pro for video editing and ZBrush for 3D sculpting. And there does seem to be a push to develop more of these performance intensive apps for iPadOS. The Android side doesn't have as many pro grade apps, but if you're mainly just concerned with finding a good note-taking or drawing app, there are plenty of great options on both sides, and these are not intensive to run, so even the Tab S10 Ultra with less performance can handle them perfectly fine. Another key difference in their software is multitasking, but only the more advanced features. Because by default, the multitasking capabilities are pretty similar too. You have a taskbar on both to easily switch between apps, and you can get into split screen configuration. However, the philosophies behind Dex on Samsung and Stage Manager on iPadOS are very different. With Samsung Dex, you get something that looks a lot like a desktop, and you can snap windows into halves and fours, just like what you can do on desktop operating systems. In Stage Manager, you cannot snap windows, but you can save stages. So you can organize different parts of your work into different stages and just pick up where you left off without having to reopen or reorganize anything, and I find this to be very convenient. Also recently, there have been so many AI features added to both tablets, and if you're just interested in voice recording transcriptions or image generation, those features are pretty comparable. However, when it comes to the writing tools, Apple Intelligence is more advanced because it lets you describe the specific change that you want, and it can also integrate directly with ChatGPT. Currently, Samsung's Galaxy AI lacks similar capabilities. Another one is Math Notes, which is only on the iPad. It just automatically solves your handwritten math problems. I don't really use it because since becoming a YouTuber, I don't do math anymore, but it's pretty sick. And finally, Genmoji also only exists on the Apple side, and it's probably the best use case of image generation currently. Since it's constrained to just emojis, it actually consistently generates good results. This is the only image generation feature that I actually use because the other ones just frequently give me wonky looking things. But Samsung's got some good stuff too. The Gemini integration as a smart assistant is quite good because you're interacting with a smarter model to get things done on your tablet, like setting multiple alarms is super easy to do. Plus, the natural language search in settings that Samsung recently came out with actually solves a very real problem, except it's not on the tablet for some reason. But the generative photo editing tools are definitely more feature-rich on the Samsung side. Lastly, let's take a look at some keyboards, which certainly make the tablets better work devices. However, the first-party keyboards are about 25% the cost of the tablet. That's kind of insane. Of course, you can get any style of third-party keyboard you want, and those are probably better value too. But it's interesting to see the drastically different styles from Apple and Samsung. The first-party keyboard for the iPad Pro is the Magic Keyboard. The iPad just snaps onto it magnetically and floats. It's angle adjustable and brings the iPad taller and closer to you, which is great. The keyboard is solid and still usable on your lap, but of course you cannot work with the keyboard detached. For the Tab S10 Ultra, its first-party keyboard is very similar to the Surface Pro. You get this kickstand that's angle adjustable, and you also get this keyboard that can be detached. It's not really usable on your lap, but since you can use the keyboard detached, you can put the Tab on something higher and work with better ergonomics. Okay, so although the Tab S10 Ultra is still probably the most impressive thing for watching content, it's losing quite a bit of ground against the iPad Pro in many ways. It used to be that if you had a Windows computer, an Android tablet is more convenient for acting as a secondary display. But now, since the iPad Pro can do that too, it's more difficult to pick the Samsung tablet over the iPad because of the iPad's superior performance and Pro app support. And in the past, Samsung always had the definitively better display, but now it's hard to argue that the coding alone makes it better than the much brighter tandem OLED display. And that's it for this comparison. I hope you learned a lot. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!